O God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be pleasing in your sight, for you are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. People who know that I visit my mom and extended family in Texas, as I just did, sometimes find it surprising to learn that I actually grew up in Florida. A couple of years before I was born, my parents moved from the little tiny, almost border town of Falfurrias, Texas, where they lived as newlyweds, to Gainesville, Florida. And I know exactly why they left Texas for Florida. My dad's company transferred him. It was as simple as that. In those days, it was all about the husband's job, and so my mother had to let the school know, the school that she was teaching at know that she would not be able to complete the school year, and off they went. But they didn't have anyone in Florida. No family, no friends. In that way, they were kind of like Abraham and Sarah, who were told to leave their country and their kindred and their parents' homes. And I'm sure that, like Abraham and Sarah, my parents went there hoping for blessings and a good life. Fortunately for us, it worked out that way. Well, I come from a family of migrants, as I suspect you all did, because your ancestors had to move around a lot to get to Oregon from wherever you came from. Well, my people definitely get around. On my mother's side, my two great-grandfathers participated in the Cherokee Strip land run, which was actually a great land heist in which a territory promised to the Cherokee Nation in perpetuity was basically stolen and given to white settlers to form the state of Oklahoma. Now, in the 1800s, my father's side of the family made their way down from the Carolinas and across the Gulf states to that fabled land of opportunity, Texas. And I have a pretty good sense of why they went there as well. Land, opportunity, and in at least a couple of cases, a fresh mission field in which to find souls to save. For I had some good Baptist preachers in my heritage. And when I look at my father's side of the family in particular, I can see echoes of Abraham and Sarah leaving their homeland in Haran and setting out with hopes and dreams for a better life, even in some cases following a sense of divine calling and a desire to answer that call. Now, as our modern testimony says of Abraham and Sarah, they made a lot of blunders, meaning my ancestors. And sometimes I feel sure that their actions did not live up to what God would have hoped of them. It can be all too easy to confuse what's good for one's family, like free land that comes from dispossessed Native Americans or Canaanites, with God's intention for humanity. And yet, given all that I do know about the families I come from, I believe that, like Abraham and Sarah, they were trying to be faithful. They were trying to be faithful people, and in their own way, big or small, to be a blessing to the people around them. Well, one of the reasons I love preaching is because I always learn something new every time I write a sermon. And this time I stumbled on a commentary that mentioned that the name of the city that Abraham and Sarah departed from, Haran, actually means crossroads. The name Haran means crossroads because it was at a crossroads in northern Mesopotamia, a tributary to the Euphrates River, and a strategic trade route. But for the matriarchs and patriarchs in Genesis, the spiritual ancestors of all the Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, Haran was more than just a geographical crossroads. It was literally the pivot point, the hinge in our spiritual origin story. Everything in the book of Genesis before chapter 12 is considered primeval history, or the prehistory of the whole world, all of creation. But beginning with chapter 12 and God's call to Abraham in these first 4 verses, we zoom in on one family who, for some inexplicable and unknown reason, God chooses to be the bearers of God's promise to restore a broken and wayward world to God's paths and God's intention for humanity. And it's really odd that we have no idea why they were chosen. The Bible is not interested in what happened in their lives or who they were before this pivotal moment in their lives. So one Congregational minister who comments on this passage writes, "We know so little about Abraham. Why would God call him? The text is silent on these matters, so we do not know, and yet we do. We know the ways of God through our experience of God today. In our churches, in our congregations, in the callings of people both lay and ordained, we can see God's method at work. We see that God does not always call those with the best credentials or the shiniest pedigrees. We see that God again and again calls those who are able to respond in faith, who respond to God in a way that leads to blessings. For God, the one who calls, is also the one who equips. When we walk out in faith, the God who calls us will also equip us for the service ahead. A little word in the ear of the search committee nominees today. Now, how many crossroads did your ancestors stand at where they had to make a choice to stay in their homeland or to risk into something radically new? To settle for the life they had or to set out for the life they dreamed of? How many of your ancestors felt pulled to embark on a new path, not just for self-serving reasons, but for a purpose larger than themselves? How many might have felt a divine tug or a whisper in their ears, calling them to service in some far-flung place? Probably many more than you know. Of course, everyone has mixed motives. That's why we have Lent every year, and why many churches include a prayer of confession in every worship service. We all have mixed motives. None of us are pure, and yet God uses us anyway, doesn't she? God takes the bad with the good, and like that divine potter God is, shapes even our misshapen parts into something beautiful and useful and good. Well, when you look at it this way, you might breathe a sigh of relief. God doesn't ask for perfection. God just asks us to do our best. God does the rest. And God also is faithful. Above all, God is faithful. The Old Testament scholar many of you have heard of, Walter Brueggemann, reads the Bible as a story of God's promises and human faithfulness, God's call and our response. The promise, Brueggemann writes, is God's power and will to create a new future sharply discontinuous from the past, to form a new community that's reliant only on God. Our faith, Brueggemann says, is the capacity to embrace that announced future with such passion that we can relinquish the present for the sake of the future. Well, Abraham and Sarah embraced God's call with passion and faith, and so they went. They didn't get stuck at the crossroads. They didn't die there of inertia because they couldn't figure out which fork in the road to take. They struck out for the new future that God had in store for them, trusting that they could understand enough of where God was leading, even though we never have perfect understanding, that they could take the next best step. Because they grasped God's hand and followed where God led, they became a blessing not only to their family and their descendants, but as we hear in this passage, to the whole world. For through them, God would bless all the families of the earth. Through them, one would come who would manifest God's saving purpose for the whole creation and reconcile the world to God's self. Well, today, this church stands at a crossroads. You are poised to take a big step towards the future that God has in store for you. Because of the faithfulness of the transition team and the council, you are now ready to elect a pastoral search committee, which will seek and find and recommend a candidate to be your new settled pastor. This is a momentous day. Do you feel it? If you don't, I hope you will when you cast your ballot in a little bit downstairs, that you will take seriously this step and the choice you make to endow 7 faithful people with the responsibility to seek and find the one God is calling to lead you into your promised future. Your transition team has prepared you for this day. And in fact, if you're on the transition team, will you stand up? I want to just thank you all for being Joanne, Ted, Bill, Julie, and Frank. Thank you. Thank you for your service. They have put together an amazing local church profile that tells this church's story and doesn't just gloss over hard parts, but tells an honest story and a faithful story, but also a story that brims with possibilities and hope for the future. You will have an opportunity to read this if you haven't yet, and I hope that you will. I think you will be inspired. Your council and I have worked hard to discern who to take this journey forward. And that journey will be now placed in the hands of the Pastoral Search Committee. And as I mentioned, 7 faithful souls have agreed to take on this critical task, and we submit their names to you today. We believe God is calling them to this role, and we trust that the one who is calling will also equip them to carry this responsibility out. Now, I know that there may be some of you who might find it hard to feel especially trusting in this moment. I know that there are some of you who feel you've been here before, maybe more recently than you would have liked. Yes, how many times? How many times? So yes, you have been at this crossroads or one that feels very similar to it before. You might feel some natural trepidation at trusting into this next step and at trusting these folks to help guide you into it. You may feel some fear at taking the wrong fork in the road. So if you are in that situation, I want to offer some assurance. I know, and of course we all know, that your last two senior pastor calls didn't work out exactly as you hoped. But that does not mean that you failed. It doesn't. It doesn't mean that your last search committee failed. It doesn't mean that the pastors failed. Because with the eyes of faith and perhaps a little distance, and as you continue on this path, you'll get more faith and more distance and be able to zoom out and see even more of the big picture. With the passage of time and the healing of hearts, I hope you will begin to see ways in which each of those previous pastorates, in fact, all of your previous pastorates, for let's face it, none of them were perfect. All of those previous pastorates did bring blessing to this congregation and to this community. Many of you, if not most of you, were drawn here during their tenures. Think of what and who we would be missing if you weren't here, if those folks that came in the past two pastorates were not here with us today. All of us would miss you. Think of the ministries that developed under these pastors that continue today, the seeds of our immigration welcoming congregation, the soul box ministries, the flowering of the Outreach Gallery into a truly public space and presence in this community for the arts. Sometimes God seems to take us on detours, like the 40 years in the wilderness that the Israelites endured. And I hope that the interim is not feeling like 40 years to you by now. But in the end, again, as we look back with eyes of faith, I hope we can see that the detours are as important as the straight lines. We wouldn't be who we are without them. Both the detours and the straight lines will get us where we need to go and teach us things we need to learn. I believe and I trust that you are better for the journey you have been on, especially in the last few years, that you have taken time to reflect, to listen to one another, to wonder, to ask questions, to dig deeper into what it means to be church and to be community together, and to listen for God's particular calling to you, to the particular blessings you have to offer the wider world. So I'd like to leave you with a final thought as you embark on your search for a new settled pastor. Remember what Reverend Olson said: God does not always call those with the best credentials or the shiniest pedigrees. What is most important to God is simply the precious gifts of faith and trust. As Reverend Epling says in our modern testimony, they were righteous because they placed their entire future in God's hands, even when that meant that they were certain to get lost along the way. And with a nod to Nicodemus's dialogue with Jesus, she concludes that, my friends, is what being born again looks like. Being born again means we are open to God recreating our lives. So to the search committee, I say, look not for the pastor with the shiniest credentials or pastoral profiles. Look for the pastor who has most demonstrated a capacity to be in a living, trustful, faithful relationship with God, who is willing to continue to allow God to recreate them and to recreate the life of the congregation. The best pastor will be the one who's continually willing to embrace what God is calling into being in their own lives and in the life of this church. Newness of life, boldness of witness, risky service to the wider community and world. Look for the faithful ones, and God will not lead you astray. Step out in faith, and you, First Congregational United Church of Christ, will bless your community and your world in ways you cannot yet imagine. Amen.